Wonderful. So thanks everybody for joining us today. We're really excited to have you. I see a lot of familiar faces and names on Zoom, but there are some that I don't recognize. So just in case anyone doesn't know who the Accelerator Center is and what we do, we're a startup incubator that provides programming, support, mentorship, and funding opportunities to technology startups. Part of our programming is our amazing mentor team, of which our moderator, Ellyn Winters-Robertson, is a part of. And she's put together this amazing session on PR to give early stage companies some tips on how to get media coverage for your startup. So with that, I will hand it over to Ellyn.
Oh, thank you so much. I am super excited. This is actually the second time we've done this event, and the first time was equally amazing. We had just a great number of journalists, great conversation, and amazing questions. So don't hold back on your questions. We're going to, I've got about 9 questions I'm going to pose to our panel, which I'm going to introduce to you in a second. And we'll work through those questions. We'll have a little group chat, like a group discussion on the panel about each question. And then I've left about we're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then I've got about 15 minutes at the end. So please, as Tabitha said, just throw your questions into the chat, and we'll deal with them as soon and as expediently as we can. Anyways, I am so pleased to have with me, I'm 3 at least, and maybe a 4th journalist joining us. You're going to learn journalists are on deadline, and if a story runs over, a story runs over. So I'd like to introduce to you, and maybe we can just get everybody to wave as we do. I've got Josh O'Kane, who's the technology reporter at the Globe and Mail. Josh is actually roaming around in Atlantic Canada, and he's joining us from a hotel room in Halifax. I've got Megan Simpson, who's a senior editor at BetaKit. Megan and I work together on tech stories, but I think most of the people in the tech community will know BetaKit very well. Everybody wants to be covered in that publication. And then we've got Tony Grace. We were originally going to have Max Warp from CTV, not that Tony's by any means a poor substitute. Max actually, COVID has struck in his household. His daughter has actually been banned from her daycare right now because she's got sniffles, so he's had to stay home. So Tony, who is a videographer with CTV News and a host, evening host, you'll probably recognize his face. So he has stepped in at the last minute, and I am so grateful. He's my hero, honestly. So anyways, we are here today. The journalists and myself are super excited to have this conversation with you today. And with that, I will get started. Okay, so our first question. The business, and I'm going to direct this to Josh to get things started, and then panelists feel free to chime in. The business of news is changing and fast. Revenue models, staffing, digitization of media. Can we talk a little bit about what it's like to be a journalist today and the pressures and constraints that you're under?
Yeah, absolutely. I will try not to give a super depressing answer. Yeah, to give you a bit of a sense, I guess, of my best understanding of the industry is sort of through the economics of newspapers. I actually graduated university into the recession, and it was quite a shock to learn that the industry I had just decided to join was one of the first to really struggle because of the economic consequences of the recession. Ad revenues plummeted, newspapers started closing, and I was like, should I keep doing this? And I decided to. Our staffing levels as a result, and if Terry's able to join us at some point, I'm sure he could speak towards this for regional newspapers. Staffing levels, newspapers in particular, have been collapsing significantly over the last 15 years. The Globe probably has about a third fewer reporters than we did when I arrived in 2011. The result is we simply can't cover everything like we used to. And this is, I say this just to sort of color future responses to other questions for the panel, so that people can have a better understanding of sort of why we cover what we do and why we can't cover everything. We have to take on stories to get readers a real sense of the zeitgeist of the industries that we cover, particularly at least at the Globe. And, I believe we'll talk a little bit later about how we decide what stories we take on, so I'll leave that aside. But on the business side, the economics of news have shifted a bit. All of us on this panel work for outlets with very different models. Outlets like BetaKit emerged as a great product of the internet economy. But those of us who are dependent on the traditional print advertising model have shifted quite a bit. The Globe now focuses on subscriptions, not just print, but digital, and we have for about 6 or 7 years. We think what I think I'm allowed to say we have probably the most subscriptions for Canadian publication, although I'm not probably allowed to describe what it is. But this means we have a sustainable business model, but also that the majority of our stores are paywall. So it is possible that a lot of the folks here have not necessarily read the Globe very regularly, because especially if you're younger and you're a very new startup, you may not have been financially able to shell out a subscription. I totally understand. But it's not ideal when you want storage spread on social media, but it's better than the paper no longer being able to afford as many reporters as we have. It's why we're able to afford to continue to cover the country as robustly as we have been, given the changing economics of journalism. It's why I'm able to be randomly in a Halifax hotel right now, and it's why I would normally be able to get out to Waterloo and Kitchener and Cambridge usually once a month when it's not a pandemic. And with that, if any of the other panelists have any thoughts they want to share about the digitization of journalism, I will stop talking.
Megan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I was going to jump in. I think, Josh, you set that up pretty well. And I guess thanks for the shout out to BetaKit there. Yeah, so I think he's really hit it on the nose. Like, I actually graduated from J school at a time when, while I was in journalism school, we were talking about, okay, well, all the current revenue models aren't working. We need to fix them, but we have no idea how. So I was kind of, not to age Josh at all, but just after. And I think it just gives a really good perspective, though, of like this understanding of like how it's been shifting over the past a little while in terms of journalism and building revenue models and stuff like that. Yeah, it's and I don't think it's been figured out yet. I don't know if my other panelists would agree with me. Like, I think it's still a work in progress, and there's lots of different ways. Josh has described what the Globe does with subscriptions. BetaKit does a very different approach. We don't have subscriptions. Anyone can view our content, but we have revenue in other ways, whether that's sponsored content. And there's other publications that do things like Patreon or different stuff like that. So there's a lot of change happening right now in the industry, especially when it comes to revenue models and trying to get out there and being that fast-paced industry that you're expected to be.
Yeah, and Tony, I was gonna bring you in on this because it's different yet again in the broadcast world, where you've always been traditionally advertising focused as well, and you don't have that privilege of a paywall that the Globe would have. So how are things changing for CTV as a whole, and then also the regional outlets? How are they coping with this changing environment?
I mean, I think that like Josh identified, for the longest time, broadcast was done the same way. The revenue model was the same, the infrastructure was the same, the pipeline looked the same, and the consumers were always on the other end of the television screen. So I started in journalism I started with CTV actually 1 week before 9/11. And first of all, that was a big, sort of wake up, welcome to journalism call. The world changed before your eyes a week after you get on the job. But it wasn't long after that. My first 5 years in journalism was the world's last 5 years without social media. So the way we did things were very, very different than they are now, I'd say, for the past 15 years. And as the proliferation of social media has changed how we've communicated, so has the way that we have delivered our product, the way we've shared our product, the way we've packaged our product. But I would say that, and perhaps Josh would agree on the print side, I think that 10 years ago, when everybody thought the demise of newspapers and the demise of television were so imminent, here we are a decade later, and we haven't seen that. We look different. We're smaller. We're forced to do things differently at a regional level. More often than not now, you'll see a one-person team instead of two-people teams like we used to see years ago in television. But the fundamentals are the same. We are still gathering video and sharing video, and whether that's digitally or on an analog format on our broadcast stations, there's an appetite. And for us, it's been about navigating the menu of news stories available to us and figuring out how to feed that appetite from a buffet that looks completely different, if I can use that type of analogy. So it's still a work in progress. I mean, we are really focusing on trying to put digital first, but we still have a very, very big demand to serve a large broadcast audience, which is larger than probably a decade ago I thought it would be today. So the shifting sands, I guess is the bottom line there.
Yeah, it's funny just because before we got started, we were joking a little bit about poor CTV. They have only 2 machines that actually do Zoom recordings, and right now, of course, with the pandemic, everything is going to be Zoom recorded, or a lot of the stories are. So we're just there's a reality of the economics of what the newsroom looks like. I just wanted to, for the audience's sake, we have Terry Pender, who's now joined us. He's our 4th panelist. Terry is he covers a lot of different areas at the Waterloo Record, including technology and the arts. I know that's a big passion to Terry, so we're happy to have you, Terry. And in fact, I'm going to put you on the spot, and I'm going to throw the next question to you. Sort of related to what Josh was talking about, when you have only limited supply of journalists and you've got this abundance of stories, tell me what does a good story look like? What are you looking for, and what do you want to write about? Because that's a really critical question for everybody that's tuning in today.
That's a great question, Ellen. Thanks a lot, and apologies for being late. I think it's really interesting. Everything has changed and nothing has changed. What interests me is a story I started a long time ago. We'll forget about that part. So what's more important than anything, I think, is if you're looking for coverage, is in advance of when you would like to see that story appear. The more advance notice, the better, and it's dead easy. Just send an email to tpender@therecord.com. Keep it short, and I promise I'll read it and get back to you. The more notice we have, the better. I can't speak for the other reporters, but for me, that's really, really important.
I know when I'm pitching a story for a client now, I often give a reporter up to a week to 2 weeks notice, just so that they can plan and work it into their schedule, because you're right. Like, you can't expect reporters to be able to cover a story right off the spot. Megan, what about you? Do you look for the same with BetaKit? What kind of a turnaround and are you looking for? And also, what kind of stories are you specifically interested in? And also, what you're not really that keen on?
Yeah, solid question. So I guess I can start off with, in terms of the reaching out. Yes, reaching out in advance is awesome. At least, I always say at least a minimum of 1 week is great. It's super helpful and allows, as we've kind of been talking, there's limited resources on teams. Even at BetaKit, for example, we only have so many people on our team, even though we cover the entire country. So the more advance notice you can give us, the better, which is, yeah. But yeah, in terms of what makes a good story for BetaKit, well, we do kind of a wide range of things that focus obviously on startups and innovation. But we'll cover everything from a new Accelerator Center cohort announcement all the way to, major Shopify news and stuff like that. But on a really basic level, like, what makes a good story is timeliness. Don't reach out 3, 4, 5, 6 months after your major milestone has happened. And in terms of like a B2B company, I always, or being a B2B publication, one thing that I always say is, if it's a company milestone that you really want to share with a media publication like BetaKit, the way that I kind of couch it and try to explain to people is, make sure it's a milestone that someone outside of your company might be interested in hearing. It's kind of like an easy way to explain like what would make for like an interesting B2B news story. Obviously, there's stuff that's outside of that, but I found that that's a pretty decent way to explain it, at least from my end. Josh, also doing kind of like business related stuff, might have some thoughts on that.
Over to you, Josh.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to echo again, the advance notice, at least a week, is very helpful. We, in this particular industry, although our newspaper doesn't necessarily like embargoed information, tech does get a little bit of an excuse, because there are, frankly, so many companies with so many really interesting announcements. And just sort of the way that we look at good stories, I mean, what I think is a good story is different than the stories that I have time to do. And it's something that I find frustrating because I really believe there's a really great wealth of stories within Canada. And the struggle that I think I find to kind of like contextualize the kind of stories we look for is I cover the whole country. There's only 2 tech reporters, myself and Sean Silkoff, Waterloo being one of the regions that I specifically cover. As a result, you know, in a good week, like in a week where there's no fires to put out, we're writing 3 stories, but we get maybe 60 pitches each. And of those 3 stories we write, like one of them is still probably a fire we have to put out, something we didn't expect. That's just breaking news that we have to handle. So we're sifting through a lot of pitches. And as a result, to contextualize further, I write for the business section of a national newspaper competing with like $5 billion deals of like WestJet getting acquired. And so our readership and the reporters that I work with are generally utilizing the news we share among those larger deals really to write about a seed stage financing round. That's literally just because we are constantly triaging the dozens and dozens of frankly great pitches that we get. We're always happy to hear about companies existing, but we do have to turn down an enormous volume of them. I always say we generally don't write about, you know, seed or Series A rounds because of the triaging we do, because sometimes, frankly, the technology already has significant market adoption, which means that, you know, there's a reason why someone may have heard of it before they read about it in the Globe. That like, you know, maybe the beta kit's been, or like the local publication has been really, really publishing a lot of great stories. And we're like, okay, this really is something that is really generating a lot of interest. That is the kind of, you know, that's one of the filters that we apply that might grant the exception to the rule of, you know, generally we don't have time. There's not enough hours in the day to write about seed or Series A rounds. Again, I really wish that we could, but there's only 2 of us, and, you know, a lot of public companies as well as really great startups and scale-up companies. So when we look at things from that perspective, if you really like, I'm always happy to see pitches. I don't have time, unlike Terry, to respond to all of them because otherwise I would just be answering emails all day. But I am looking at all of them. But really, if you are going to be if you want to share a story, think about the way that people use your technology, particularly with B2B, business to business style technology. Try to find a way to make that relatable to people who are not in either of those 2 industries that's one side from the other. Because otherwise it's really hard to convince an editor that this company that does not necessarily have a great deal of, you know, outside financing might not necessarily be relatable to a reader. And we ultimately want to, you know, as I mentioned, I'm competing with $5 billion deals like on a regular basis. So we have to sort of look at what makes the story most relatable. And the easiest thing to do is say, you know, this is a Series B round. They have an established track record, a product that's going to market. But otherwise, what else makes it relatable? And you really have to think about that when you're crafting your pitch.
And relatable to a national audience in your case, because you are dealing with people that, you know, are coast to coast, right? In terms of your readership at the Globe. So,
correct. Yes.
You know,
and
so that's a lens that has to go on top of it as well.
For sure. And that lens doesn't apply to everyone. And one of the reasons why I'm very glad that we have the wide variety of outlets here is that, you know, I will often tell people that, listen, I don't have the capacity to cover this, but you really need to go pitch BetaKit or The Logic to great national tech websites that have really great staff and more staff covering the ecosystem, which allows for coverage to happen even if we're not able to do that. So I often send folks that way. Or even I'll say, listen, I will say, you may want to reach out to your regional or local publication. And then, you know, in a year or 2, come back, show me what you've done. And then I would really like to write about you when the moment is right.
Right. Sometimes patience, I always say PR is a long game. Tony, now, when you're pitching a story for broadcast, there's other elements because you have to think about, or we should be thinking about, what does that moving picture look like as well? So can you talk a little bit to that and what that requirement looks like for broadcast?
Right. So visual strength is a very, very key factor for us in deciding whether we're going to do a story for what is largely a medium that thrives and subsists on video. So whether it's television or whether it's digital, we are going to want to be able to show something. We are going to want people to be able to see something in action. That's changing a little bit now that we do a lot of digital writing as well online. We are doing a lot more stories that are a little copy heavier than they used to be, and we're doing digital only pieces that are written only versus video. But generally, for a TV video story, we are looking for stories that can be told visually, whether it's through displaying something, whether it's through having a really great spokesperson who can encapsulate some of the points they're trying to make in very easy, broadly understood sound bites. We're looking to hold an audience with perhaps a rather limited attention span, because we're covering so much over the course of an hour or a half hour or on the website. But I would say that some things that can bring together a good story pitch, aside from the medium itself, is factors that we look for that we would probably consider motivators to a wide audience. So safety, family, money, health, community. Those are things that if one of those jumps out at us from a story pitch, we may say, hey, this is really worth doing a story on, because it's going to appeal to a lot of people. So in addition to the medium itself, of course, there's the subject matter itself and how hyper-focused or macro-focused it might be.
I'll slightly change the question that I had before, because I think you guys have kind of touched on it a little bit already, which is, what startups should do. But if somebody is preparing to pitch you, what are sort of the basics in terms of, what should a startup be thinking about doing before they take fingers to keyboard and decide to email Terry Pender with that lovely message? That's a little bit of it. And then the other is, present company excluded, because everyone here has taken the time to really get to know what a journalist's mindset's like. But I do have had encounters with startups before where they think journalists are part of their marketing team or sales team. So can you talk a little bit to what your role is in terms of helping startups get their story out the door? Let's see, who will I throw that to? I'm going to throw that to Megan first. We're going to get you started on that one.
Yeah, what's our, yes. So yeah, we're not your PR agency. I guess I'll start with that. What you should do before pitching. You should have a PR person, pay that PR person, and make sure you're aligned with that PR person. No. Well, that is my advice. Well, that is my advice. Obviously, BetaKit, we work with a lot of startups, and so we know that's not something, at least in our experience, in my experience, it's, we understand that and connect with a lot of founders themselves or whatever it is, entrepreneurs who are running their businesses who might not be their PR person. So one thing I always suggest is trying to actually work with some type of PR team and prioritizing reaching out to the press like you would creating your product or marketing that product. I know that might sound super simple, but it's important, because working with so many startups across Canada, from we just launched our product 2 weeks ago to IPO. I have a full experience of what that is kind of like, and it can be hard to deal with media if you don't understand. So while I'm kind of kidding, having a PR person or someone who knows that before you're pitching media can always be helpful. Sorry, I forgot what your second question was after I.
Well, it was really how to prepare. So if they're getting ready to contact you, what should they be doing before they make an approach to BetaKit?
Yeah. So yeah, obviously we've already talked about this, reaching out in advance. And then this was kind of mentioned earlier, but connect with myself or someone on the BetaKit team or whatever, obviously only speaking for BetaKit, but you can obviously apply this to other journalists as well, I'm sure, but reaching out beforehand and making a connection, even if you don't have news, I always say, just reach out, get to know me, send me an email, I'll connect with the founders. And then when you guys do have news, it's a lot easier to kind of ramp up something or be able to connect and understand what's going on, because we have that pre-existing relationship. So yeah, don't be scared to reach out, even if you don't have news, just be like, hey, Megan, really wanted to get to know you. I can share my contact info or whatever later. I'm the best person at BetaKit to reach out to for that stuff. But yeah, so reach out in advance, connect in advance. And yeah, make sure that you're kind of just prepared and you know what you want to share, which is always like kind of that PR person can help with that.
Terry, I saw you nodding when Megan said, like, just reach out and say hi.
Sure. I may not respond to those right away, though, but it's always nice to hear. Well, what I would suggest, if you're not used to dealing with the media and you can't afford PR people, is think of your elevator pitch and give me the elevator pitch is a really, really great idea. If you've had no coaching in, honing your elevator pitch, then keep it really short. Tell me what's new and innovative about your tech and why anyone should care. That's just, yeah, we're all pressed for time, and that would be great. And just to follow up with something Josh said, it's really interesting to have on this panel local, national media. And as a local reporter, I love getting in there as early as possible. I've written about lots of startups when they're still in the lab. There's no investors anywhere around, and it can still be a very, very interesting story. And then Series A, B, and C for sure. That's all grist for the mill. And when you start getting traction and you get big, then national reporters like Josh and others can pick the story up from there. It's interesting because I've written about some startups before they had any funding. And then when they start getting the Series A, B, and C, I come across these embargoes, which I generally don't like at all. Neither do my editors. And when the embargo's in place because the startup founders want to give another reporter an exclusive for 12 hours, that really, we don't like that, to put it bluntly, but your company, your call.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the U.S. media love their embargoes, but there's a real double-edged sword to that because you're sort of gift wrapping a story over to one journalist, but everybody else gets left out. So it's not something I personally love either, and sometimes have to resort to that tactic. So Josh, one of the things and I'm going to throw something to you just for consideration, which is I always say, read the journalist's work for heaven's sakes before you go make an approach, and read that publication so that you become familiar with it. You're going to really get a feel for the kinds of stories that journalists are interested in reporting on. But we're trying to build a relationship here for heaven's sakes. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Two throwbacks to previous things. One, to go with what Terry was saying, you get one. You don't get an embargo and an exclusive because as soon as one person publishes the exclusive, it is generally accepted practice within journalism that everyone else hits publish. And I can't remember, I know at least Megan, you were on this story. I won't say what story this was earlier this year, but she's shrugging like she knows, where there was an exclusive offered to a publication, but everyone else got an embargo. And then everyone else hit publish as soon as the first publication got the exclusive. The publication that got the exclusive was confused and frustrated. And in the end, I don't even think the PR person might work for that company anymore. And so it kind of caused we were all just side messaging each other. A lot of us are friends in this industry. We don't necessarily super compete. We're always just we're each trying to think about how to give the best coverage in what we do. But if you're going to offer someone an exclusive, you can't really tell anybody else about it because otherwise you're just going to have a bunch of cascading stories and a bunch of frustrated people. So yeah, not to say that I don't love exclusives, which I do, but don't promise both exclusives and embargoes to other people because you're just going to make a bunch of journalists frustrated at each other and the PR people, all of whom are just trying to do their jobs. And I can't remember what the specific question that you asked. You had actually asked.
That's okay. That's okay. This is all valuable. This is all valuable. No worries. No worries.
Oh yeah, it's about reading a publication. Yes, it's really, really important. And in fact, literally last week, someone messaged me with a pitch, just being like, "Hey, I've got this. This person is not from the Waterloo region or anything. I have a lot of general national stories, but they were just like, hey, I've got this startup we just started in March, and we're doing this." And I was just like, at this point, there was no understanding of what your market adoption had been. This business model was very similar. In fact, there was another company I had written about with a very similar business model that was actually a little more interesting in the same city. And I gave the same response that I often give when I have time to respond to these emails was, thanks for this. Can you come back to us when you have some sense of market adoption? Because otherwise my editors aren't going to take a story without a sense of how much traction that you've gotten, because we don't want to necessarily write about a company that didn't do anything and is going to continue to not do anything and doesn't exist next year. And their response was, oh, it's too bad you only give coverage to the companies that don't need it and give them promotion. And I was like, we don't do promotion. And this goes back to what you were asking Megan earlier. We don't see ourselves as a promotional wing. What we want to do, and like everyone has a different version of this, but like within the Globe, because I work in the context with our deal making reporters and our banking reporters and our telecom reporters, you know, we have to like literally, like when you open up the paper, you want to get a snapshot of what things are that day. And if someone made a really cool product and they announced it was the news that they announced that product, or they announced their Series C or something like that, yeah, that's going to be part of that big mix, because it's important to know how money flows and how technology and innovation goes. That's what we look at. We want to capture an image on a daily basis of where smart money is going and where smart ideas are going. If you think about pitching any journalist in that sense, and you frame your pitch about that, you're much more likely to get a response from multiple publications. And I think it's a very valuable way of thinking about it, because that's how most of us think. And the Globe being a very old and rigid institution, it's very much about, let's make a snapshot of the day. And so we're not out there to necessarily promote stuff. But if you're doing something really interesting and there's something new there, then it fits in the news and then it makes the snapshot. That's the new in news, which is something I forget about until I say that on like things like this, like once a year. But if you take a look, like we have author pages on our website, and a lot of people, when they ask us what we do, I just send them my own author bio and Sean Silkoff's author bio and be like, these are all the staff, and Tamsin McMahon, who's our Silicon Valley correspondent. She doesn't really cover Canadian startups. But the three of us, I'll send our author bios. Just be like, if you look, these are the last 20 stories we've written. And this is a sense of the flavor of what we're doing. We're not out there to necessarily promote. We're out there to really show what the ideas are at any given moment and the way that smart money is flowing in the ecosystem.
Right,
I think I repeated myself like 6 times in there, but I hope
that's okay. That's okay. That's okay. I want to take this in a slightly different direction. I'm going to point this to Tony, which is really one. You tell us about. So because you guys live in a very daily breaking news, all of you, world. Tell me what maybe you can describe for the folks that have joined what a news cycle is and why it is important to try and tie into that. And then the other rule of thumb, which I know it seems very basic to us in the industry, but you can only announce news once. And Megan, I think you've been tricked on that one. So I'll start with Tony in terms of sort of telling us a little bit about a news cycle.
Sure. I mean, in my sort of view and in my experience, the news cycle is generally what we use to describe the cycles and the themes of stories that are in the current rotation, so to speak. So probably the biggest thing to upend the news cycle this year is the thing that upended all of our lives, obviously, the pandemic. 19 years ago, it was 9/11 when I was that 21-year-old kid starting out in my reporting career. I would say that the news cycle is something to be very aware of, because if what you're doing has any direct link to the current news cycle, then it's going to elevate its importance in terms of interest at a local, regional, and national level. And I think back to even when things were getting a little bit weird before the pandemic, when everyone was thinking about, do I cancel my vacation? Do I cancel this? Do I do that? Do I buy this? Do I do that? We were starting to think about things like the role that local companies were playing in this overall. And I remember one of the first things we did was we had a CEO in from a local company that was considering the idea of pivoting to PPE. And it wasn't even us who wanted this person in. It was BNM Bloomberg, who's one of our sister stations in the CTV Bell Media Network. So this is just an example of how local stories and tech stories and business stories can suddenly become a part of the national conversation, is if they fit like a perfect puzzle piece into the current news cycle. So whether it's making PPE, whether it was manufacturing something that was going to help workplaces adapt to the new normal, whether it was something that was going to speak to our own personal safety and security when we're traveling, interacting with others, those were the types of pitches and stories that went right to the top right away. I could think of, probably think back to sort of what I would call some evergreen examples. And that was when we were all hearing about the big shift that was happening with rideshare companies and the traditional taxi industry and the impact that was having. Well, that was a major story in the news cycle for the better part of a year, when that shift was evolving and when it was changing not only our personal habits, but raising questions for those who were involved in the business community on both sides, questions about limitations and questions about opportunities. So there was a story in the news cycle that became evergreen. It became, okay, what are local companies doing to contribute to this technology? What are others doing to try and preserve jobs? How is this going to change the way we pay, the way we interact? You could pick stories like, the evolution of ride sharing, the pandemic, 9/11, and you can look at a million different ways those can affect your local and regional news ecosystem. And if what you're pitching can somehow add to that conversation, it's probably going to rise right to the top very quickly.
Right. And Megan, what about you can only announce news once?
Yes, that's a good point. I will clarify one thing. Beta catches a lot of people trying to announce their news.
Yes, you do.
It's more something getting
you
tricked.
do.
So we catch a lot of it.
Right. Better words, yes.
No worries. No. It's all good. Yeah, so I think that goes back to what I'd mentioned earlier around like this timeliness. Yeah, not to like, I won't name any names or anything, but we get a lot of companies who might announce funding and then announce new funding, but then also there's more like that funding they previously announced, they're trying to like meld it in there as one example. And there's been lots of circumstances on that. You've probably seen some coverage on BetaKit around some of that stuff where we call that out a little bit. But yeah, it's news. It's new, it has to be that timeliness and you're announcing it kind of relatively to when you maybe close a deal or when you reach a milestone or have a partnership with a major company or incumbent. These are just examples, obviously. And to the point of kind of that news cycle as well, one thing I've really noticed in the pandemic, I almost describe it as there's like two levels. There's this level right now, and it really started in April, where BetaKit completely kind of pivoted what we were even looking at and covering because everyone's world had changed. And I think all of us kind of had something similar in our businesses. And so now there's like this level of COVID coverage where you might have things like, if your company's doing something related to that, pitch us, there might be some opportunities there. And then there's this level where it's really come back now to regular kind of news and business coverage as well, where companies are now comfortable in closing deals and doing all sorts of stuff like that. So in terms of the news cycle, that's what, I've really seen in the past 7 months. How long have we been in this? 7 months.
I know. Forever.
Yeah.
Josh, is there a difference? I'm going to actually throw this to both Josh and Terry. At a region, is there a difference between news cycles at a regional versus a national level?
Good question. I guess just kind of throw it back in the context that I had earlier, is I kind of have to choose my stories on a daily basis out of like a flood of great ideas that come from across the country. And so more great ideas wind up uncovered just as a consequence of that. And so our news cycle is like, I could like, as an example, the context depends on a given day. So let's say that a company from Vancouver announces like a Series C extension of like $100 million. At the same day that a company from Kitchener announces a Series B, and I've been trying to get that Series B story out, and I heard it might be coming. And then 10 a.m. comes, and like I'm on the phone with my editor, and he's like, "What are you covering today?" Like we have to have a pretty serious conversation about like which in the context of what Canadians might want to hear, what is the biggest story, and then we kind of hope, you know, the Canadian press or Newswire will pick up the other story. And as a result, you know, great stories wind up on the cutting room floor a lot, which is a regret. But a lot of what I have to do is triage. And there are stories I wish I could pick up, and, you know, you genuinely hope that folks like Terry or Steph Ashley are able to pick up all of those great stories, because you're kind of stuck. And like, that's not even going for, I've had stories of a company announcing that it's valued at $2 billion that I've been writing about for years. And it gets buried on page B5 because there were more of the $5 billion stories that came out that day. And it looks like we don't care that much about the news. But like, in the objective sense, when all of the business editors sit around the table, the virtual table now, you know, they do have to sort of look at what are the actual biggest stories. And so oftentimes stories that I think are really, really great get in the back of the section or barely get promotion on the website. And it's because you are stuck within the flow of news and it's totally unpredictable. Whereas, you know, it's great to, you know, see actual local and regional reporters being able to dig into those stories and tell them at the right time, probably better than we're able to, because they don't have quite such a, like a wide mandate.
Yeah. And Terry, you know, to your point, you said you cover startups long before they kind of hit that Globe and Mail League. And I have to salute, the Waterloo Record is so very generous with its coverage of, you know, almost feature level coverage of, well, it is feature level coverage of startups as they're emerging. So it's amazing. So what does the news cycle look for a publication like the Waterloo Record?
It's an interesting question because the industry is changing so much as we focus on digital subs. So the news cycle really is moving to a 24/7, 365 model and digital first. But if you're interested before digital subs dominate the industry, and it's heading that way, but it's not there yet with a lot of papers. If you want coverage in the physical paper, then I need to have that conversation. I have a Zoom meeting with my editors and all the reporters in the newsroom every morning at 9 a.m. And like Josh, I have to tell them what I'm doing that day. And sometimes I get a pushback that, well, why do you want to do that? And that's when I will say, well, this tech has the potential to impact this sector of the economy, you know, this number of people. Again, it comes back to that elevator pitch style. I have to make a pitch to my editors too. And if I get a green light, then I need to speak to somebody very soon. I mean, before noon. And it generally doesn't take long, 15, 20 minutes on the phone. And then I get the story written and I'll make the publication the next day. Sometimes if it sits on the web for a day or two before it gets in the paper, I think it affects the editor's decisions about where it will be placed. But again, getting in touch early and responding to phone calls. You may not be aware that we've said, yeah, we're going to do this story, and I'm calling and I'm not getting an answer, or someone says, can I call you back at 5 o'clock? No, no is the short answer. Forget about it. If you want to make the paper the next day, you know, you got to get back very soon. And I'm just reading I'm sorry, Ellyn, I just have to jump in on some of these questions that people.
Yeah, no. I was gonna cherry pick one myself here, which is the whole one about earned versus paid versus. So there's this earned thing that's happening. So knowing that, you know, journalists there's limited number of journalists, limited number of stories that can be covered. You know, how can startups use their own news engine and their own owned capacity? And also we're starting to see, especially vertical media, trade media in particular, where it used to be in the past, if I said to an editor in a vertical publication, oh, look, I advertise with you, therefore you should cover me, I would be thrown right out onto the curb. but that is now changing. And so now we're seeing a lot more sort of what we used to call advertorial, but there's a lot more paid content, sponsored content now creeping into mainstream media. Again, I think it's, we're trying to figure out the business model. So I'd be really interested to hear what that says. And then Terry, please feel free. I'm pretty much done my questions at this point. So let's start addressing some of the questions that are coming in from the audience.
Yeah, so there was one, and I get this a lot. That's why I want to get onto it right away. Is can we look at the story before it's published? Can we, make sure the tone is right? It's pretty much a hard rule that the answer is no. In some cases, I'll take it to an editor if I'm trying to give you an example of when there was startup that we were writing about, Nicoya Life Sciences, really interesting tech. But years ago when I was writing about them, we're trying to explain that tech in everyday language. And they said, look, we would like to read that paragraph or those 2 paragraphs about how you're explaining our tech for your general audience. And I went to my editor and talked to him, and he said, yeah, send him those 2 paragraphs. And we did. But these are exceptions. And on that note, if you can't explain your tech to me in simple language, then we're probably going to have a problem. You need to think about that from the very beginning. Another question I really like here is, what non-funding related stories am I interested in? I'm interested in writing about members of your team if they have interesting backgrounds, particularly if they've come out of some other tech companies in this region or across the country and they're moving here to work for a startup. I'm interested in a big interest in your eureka moments, why you decided to focus on this particular innovation, what caused you to first think about it, what did you see, and a lot of times, frankly, those are my favorite stories to write about. Very, very early stage, but a small team coming together and pursuing something that has grabbed their attention, and I'd like to know why. And those are really, really good stories. Anyways, I'm turning into a windbag here. Over to someone.
No, that's okay. I think you're absolutely right. Like, I think, startups should not be afraid. It's not all about the product. I know their world is about the product, but it's much more about the stories that are going on. It's what's happening in the business behind the scenes that actually make for really good story fodder. Josh, we have a question here that, said, give us an example of a startup story. And we will probably have to name names here, but outside of a funding story, is there a particular story that really struck you as just somebody came to you with a really interesting story that you ended up covering and it was a startup?
Give me 1 second. I'm trying to figure out if I got the right name. I cannot remember the name of the startup, so I'm going to feel like a real jerk here. But I am really interested in hearing stories about people who are not traditionally entrepreneurs. And I did a story, right before the pandemic, like early February. And it was a seed stage funding round that this person announced. And I was like, I do, as I mentioned, I do read all of them. I'm not able to respond to them. And I looked at this, and it was an Indigenous oil field worker from Alberta who started a temp agency specifically finding work for individuals who have been marginalized in various parts of society, individuals who have been victims of domestic violence, Indigenous individuals from remote communities, folks who do not normally have access to really great work opportunities. And they were basically embedding these folks in these companies. And I was like, this is a story. This is a great story. And I said yes before. It was one of the rare instances where I said yes before I ran it by my editor, because I was just like, this is a really, it's to me, I was just like, this isn't really a tech story. This is just an entrepreneur who had her finger on the pulse and just absolutely nailed it. And I just, we got the story and I thought it was really, really great. And it's, it's a business idea more than a piece of technology, really. The technology they use algorithms to sort of help match individual sort of keywords in the resume to the kinds of keywords that we're looking for the positions, but it was fundamentally a very humanist company that's growing very quickly out of Calgary. And that's just a great example of just like, if your business model is really tackling a problem of society rather than just something that, rather than developing, if you can focus your pitch, I should say, on what you're actually sort of doing to, fundamentally have a lot of people get into the game to make the world a better place. Talk about that. A lot of what I have to do when I pitch to editors, like when I take your pitch to an editor, is I have to explain like what is the sense of market adoption. Even if the market adoption is small, if it's targeting a segment of the market that no other business has targeted before, then it's worth highlighting. And that was just a great example. And now I'm going
to throw one more question at Tony, and then I'm going to open up the mic to folks because there are still lots of questions here coming in. So brace yourself, people, because the flood's coming. Tony, there's a Nigel Bailey asks a great question in the chat, which is, and it was one I had on my list, which is PR fails. What kind of tactics have you seen where, either startups or just tech companies in general have tried to get coverage and have just failed miserably? I know we're throwing people really under the bus here, but it's important that we know that. One of my favorite things that goes around is Muckrack's PR fails. They have a regular one, so that's always fun. So Tony, what are your thoughts?
No, and that's a good point. And I actually think that this goes beyond the tech world into a lot of the other areas that we cover in general news as well. And one of the biggest PR fails is a 3-page long news release. And I'm not saying that because we don't want to take the time to read a 3-page news release, which gets to the point 2/3 of the way down the second page. But it actually goes back to what Meg is saying about, have a PR person or have your version of a PR person. If you have somebody within your organization who can explain to me in one sentence what you're doing and why this should be a news story today, then your pitch goes right to the top of the pile. The news cycle, which we've touched on, the staffing challenges, which we've touched on, the changing landscape of media, which we've touched on, all contribute to us having fewer people to sit down and read 3-page long news releases. Not to mention, if it's taken you that long to get your pitch out, how are we going to tell that in a 90-second story? So the pitch, brevity is the soul of wit. I still remember that from Shakespeare back in high school, but it's true. Keeping it simple, keeping it focused, and keeping it very, very sharp is really what helps the cream rise to the top in the pitches. And I would add too, that as much as we've spoken about deadlines, we really are 24-hour industries online. If you can have somebody available on a weekend to speak to a really interesting tech story, that could make the difference between us doing it and not. And us doing it could be the difference between CTV National picking it up on the weekend or it going into our digital mix, which then becomes a 24/7 cycle. So timing is important, but sometimes timing can be your friend in a 24-hour news cycle as well. So be willing to pitch whenever you need to and however you need to, but please keep it focused so that the ball can at least get rolling.
Right. Megan, I'm sure you've seen your share of PR fails.
I guess so. I'm trying to think. I think your question was more directed to failing to get kind of media coverage and stuff like that. And to be honest, more so from my perspective when it comes to beta kit is a lot of the PR fails are actually, even if you do get coverage and then, for example, being upset, like you said something on the record, for example, to one of my writers, and then we publish it and you're like, well, I didn't want you to write that.
I may have been involved in one of those.
I wasn't, no, it happens more than you'd like to think. And so that to me is more of a fail. I've had some, very similar circumstances around that have gotten a little crazy, which is why, back to my suggestion, having a PR person, or as Tony, I think, said, your version of a PR person. That's actually a really great way to say it. Someone who could understand even a little bit what it means when you're talking to a reporter can be really helpful. So yeah, tons of examples. But the best thing is just be aware of, the news you're sharing and and what you want to share it and how you share it, I guess. But yeah.
Perfect. Now I know everybody's time is valuable. I just want to open it up for a few extra questions. If you can hang on just for a few minutes, Josh. I know you're really tight. If any of our panelists have to drop off, I totally understand.
I have a few more minutes, so that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. So let's throw it out there for a couple of questions if we can. Anybody want to raise their hand? I'm just gonna.
Life of Savior.
Okay.
Sure.
All right.
I can go. I don't see the digital hand option. So I have a quick question because I manage PR relation in my previous companies as well. I always debate how important is it to distribute a press release via services like Business Wire, Cision, because now I'm a startup founder. So I'm debating if it is really worthwhile to spend that kind of money to get media coverage.
I have an answer to that if no one else wants to jump in. Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, I mean, it definitely can be valuable, and I think it depends on the type of publication that you're looking to reach. When it comes to a startup like BetaKit, if you reach out in advance with that press release, like we talked about, like a week before you're set to put it on a wire or ready to announce, we already have it, and so we have access to that. So building that relationship with reporters can be really valuable as well. Not saying there's no value in putting something on the wire, and again, I think other journalists in different mediums might have a different perspective, but from my perspective, as long as you connect with me beforehand and I have that press release in my hand, I don't necessarily need to access it on the wire.
Okay, I think Life of Server had a question. If we can just,
hi.
Yeah.
Hi. We're just wondering, we have a fairly large Facebook page, so we actually get people that reach out to us, wanting to kind of advertise with us. And they seem all the same. We look at it, we kind of go, it's spam, and we move on. So when we want to approach media about our startup, we're stuck kind of at the subject line. As I said in my question, we read, okay, it's all about the subject line, and to get people to open up your email and read the rest. And that's where we sit and we go, oh gosh, what is a good subject line? Because for us, when we get messages, it just looks like spam to us. So my question is, how do you come up with an attractive 3-word subject line?
Great question.
Story pitch for a new startup. That gets my attention.
Yeah, very explanatory. Get cute.
Yeah, and I think this comes back to what we were talking about earlier about targeting. Think about who you're sending it to. Don't blanket. If you really want to get people's attention, like we don't have the capacity, as I said, to write about every new startup. But if you can tell me in the subject line, in 10 words or less, somehow manage to figure out what it is you do that's different than anyone else, and what is new that you're going to tell me about that business. That to me, those two things combined, I'm like, okay, I'm going to give this a read. Those are the subject lines that even if I can't write the story, I will actually make the time to respond, because they're usually a company I want to keep on my radar for the next time they do announce something for I have the ability to do it.
Would you recommend putting, okay, so you see that the emails from Life of a Server app, would you recommend putting our name in the subject line, or just something catchy like a story pitch with your name, or not include your name in the startup or in the subject line?
That's a good question. I would say the earlier stage that you are, the less likely I'm going to know your name already. And so that gives you a few more words to describe what it is that you do. And then in the first sentence you say, hey, we are from Life of a Server or another organization. That could be different. I would say for someone like Terry, who is much more zoomed in on the ground, who is probably more likely to have heard of you and wants to foster more relationships within a single community rather than more broadly nationally.
Yeah, I think keep in mind, guys, that journalists are expert at assimilating and synthesizing information really quickly. So they can, if you keep it short, sweet, phrase your email. It's partly about a subject line, but it's also about framing an email in such a way where, the big thing about when you're writing press releases or writing emails, is the who, what, where, when, and why of a news story. That's really, if you get that across to a journalist in an email and just bullet it so that they can quickly see, in fact, even put your email like that, who, what, where, when, and why. That's not a bad way to kind of talk in terms that a journalist understands.
And Ellyn, if I could just,
my 2 cents.
yeah, Ellyn, if I could just add something too, to what you said.
Yeah.
We are doing an incredible amount of triaging, you're right, in our inboxes. I think we all are, let's be honest. But at least for television and for video, if it can touch on one of those motivators, if your subject line can touch on one of those motivators that we talked about earlier, family, money, security, health, and if it can get the name of a local community in there as well, I know that's something that we would notice right away, as opposed to a generic
which is part of doing your homework on that target that you're going after and knowing what they're interested in covering, right? And BCC is not your friend, right, people?
No.
Right? Don't send the same message out to every journalist on the planet. Don't spray and pray.
No.
And
Okay.
with to that,
I think
say at least twice a week, I still get an email and it's like, hello, and it's just a bunch of underscores.
wonderful.
Like, it's just like, you didn't even take the time to think about who I am. Like, obviously, you didn't even finish the email. We're not going to read that. So really take the time and
Oh,
through it if you're planning on personalizing it. And if you're going to take the time to personalize it by name with all those underscores, maybe think about what that publication is doing.
shoot me in the head. Shoot me in the head, people. Look, I think we pretty much have to wrap up. Our panelists are busy people. They got to get on to writing stories and list and absorbing those pitches that you're sending. I'm sure that your inboxes are filling up and LinkedIn invites are filling up as we speak. I just wanted to say a sincere thank you to all of you for being so incredibly gracious and doing this with me. It's been absolutely fantastic. We've got all the questions. I'm sure Tabitha will grab them all out of the chat. If there's questions there that we haven't been able to answer, if I can't answer them personally, I'm sure maybe the folks on the panel might be willing to maybe even provide a little bit of an FAQ or work with me on an FAQ. This has been recorded, so we do have it available. I just wanted to again say thank you so much for taking the time. It's been invaluable to me, and I'm sure it's been invaluable to those who've tuned in.
Awesome. You're welcome, Ellyn.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, everyone.
All right,
Everyone.
great.
Before everyone goes, if you do have further questions, throw them in the chat. And as Ellyn said, I will grab them. And then our team will put together a response to as many as we can reasonably and circulate it after.
And in terms of connecting, Brad has asked how to get in touch with the reporters. Obviously, you're all on LinkedIn. You all have email addresses that are readily available off your publications. I think if you just go to Josh's page on the Globe and Mail, you'll see his address and Megan as well. Tony's a little bit more generalized in terms of CTV, but if they feel comfortable, we can actually do a run through of email addresses if folks are willing.
tpender@therecord.com. That's all you have to take away from this Zoom meeting, folks.
Josh?
I'm JOKANE@globeandmail.com. Don't put an apostrophe in there. It won't work. And also the company that I was describing earlier was Virtual Gurus from Calgary.
Okay.
I thought that's who it was. Sorry. I'm my first name, MEAGAN, Megan.Simpson@betakit.com. Super easily and accessible. If I spelled that wrong, it's also on my Twitter bio, so you can find it really easily there.
And Tony?
And I'm Tony, TONY.Grace, GRACE @CTV.ca. And Tony Grace CTV on Twitter.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, follow all of these guys on Twitter.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks, Ellyn.
All right. Thank you.
Everybody.
Bye. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
Thanks.